Hello, my name is Josh Atwell. I'm a senior technology advocate at Splunk, and I'm also an avid Twitter user, which led me to this conversation that I'm having with my good friend, Tim Crawford. Tim, how are you?
I'm doing great, Josh, and I'm so glad to have this conversation with you live here in video.
Now, so Tim, what is it that you do?
So I'm a CIO and strategic advisor at Avoa, so I spend a lot of time bringing that CIO perspective to other fellow CIOs, but then also to other organizations that are looking to tap into that experience.
Awesome. And so I've been a fan of yours for a long time, Tim. Even before you started doing CIO in the Know
The
podcast.
checks are still coming.
Thank you. But one of the things I always love, as a Twitter consumer, is when you throw out a point of view, right? You'll say my POV, and you'll lay something out. And last week you did this, and it inspired this conversation. All right. So you stated that the pandemic crisis and the economic crisis that we're currently in, if anybody's wondering, it is April 13th, 2020, the 16th month of this year, it feels like. Um, but but you stated that the pandemic crisis and economic crisis will create significant pressure for enterprises to move away from managing their own infrastructure and data centers. And well, I can see that sentiment, but I also have some disagreement with that. So first, lay out your initial thoughts and your initial argument.
Yeah, and I'm just one perspective and bringing a lot of experience to the conversation, but I'm looking forward to hearing yours as well and others that might be watching this video. So where I'm coming from is the perspective of as we go through the pandemic crisis and as we start to think about the economic crisis, we're going to be looking for flexibility. We're going to be looking to advance some of the things that we had already started. And one of those aspects is around the data center. It's around cloud. The data center is a very complicated and expensive asset. And this is something that we've been trying to move away from as much as possible. Now, Edge and IoT will pull us back into that a bit. But how can we advance some of those activities, some of those projects into cloud? And I think the economic crisis is going to add a little more oomph into getting organizations to move into cloud so that they then have the levers to be able to size up or size down as needed. And
And
that was kind of the basis.
yeah, and that led me to want to ask one question. What is unique in your mind with respect to this current situation, this current crisis, that is significantly different than what they've looked at for the last year? Like when they looked at their fiscal year budget and their roadmap for cloud adoption, what about this crisis do you think is so significantly different that creates that motivation?
Well, I think the single biggest motivation is flexibility from an economic standpoint. Being able to move the dollars around to spend on one thing or another as needed. When you move into cloud, it does give you the flexibility to either size up or size down or move to different services as needed. Now, there's a little bit of theory and a little bit of reality that we have to layer in there. And the theory part is it's something that does allow you to move around pretty easily. The reality is a little bit different. It's a little more complicated than that. And let's just get the elephant in the room out on the table. I'm not trying to say that cloud is cheaper. Cloud is not cheap. There's been this narrative from the beginning, cloud is less expensive, right? You and I have had a number of conversations around this. Cloud is not cheaper on the whole, but it does give us the flexibility that we otherwise wouldn't have in our corporate data center. And that was kind of the basis of where I was coming from.
Yep. Yeah, and I absolutely agree with you wholeheartedly, particularly on the last point. But I also think that because of that, that's actually an argument of why this isn't going to put pressure to significantly increase the investment in cloud. Particularly two components. One, this has created a lot of disruption in IT organizations who are responsible for making that migration from applications that are on premises to those that go in the cloud. Two, most organizations have a fairly defined cloud migration framework. They've looked at their application portfolio. They've done investment and rationalization on the cost model, and whether or not it's appropriate to invest in moving an application to cloud. And on the other hand, those a big part of what's happening today, unless that application is residing on-prem, and to the point you're making about flexibility, just isn't handling what's going on. I don't see a significant change to that prioritization applications, unless, to my point, they highlight that something's not providing them enough agility. Because especially now that more organizations are more cash strapped than they were before, moving to an uncertain cost model is a risk, compared to the known, understood what they're going to have, even maintenance or doing, that path that they have. Like there's a lot of uncertainty.
Well, I think
there.
one of the pieces though that you touch on is really important to maybe expand upon, and that is the uncertainty that cloud brings. You mentioned about uncertainty and costs with cloud. That's not necessarily true if you're planning accordingly. Now, there are a lot of enterprises, they move the application to cloud. They don't think about provisioning it or re-architecting it or right-sizing it for cloud. Cloud is not the same as your corporate data center. It doesn't work the same way. And so it's important to understand how you can take advantage of those cloud resources in an appropriate way. It's kind of like the old adage of renting a car, right? It'd be the equivalent of going to the car rental company every day, day after day, and renting the biggest car you think you might need.
For the next 3 years.
If you do that for the next 2 years, right? That's incredibly expensive. Nobody in their right mind would do it. But yet, this is exactly what companies are doing with lift and shifts. They're taking that application, they're moving it to cloud and going, oh my gosh, the sky is falling. This is really expensive, and we didn't expect that. We heard that cloud was cheaper. Well, let's back up the horse a little bit here, because you've got to start thinking about how to appropriately leverage cloud. I think the one piece here that is also important to understand is the economic downturn is going to cause us to, and it already is, starting to cause organizations to think very differently about the decisions they make around some of these workloads and applications. Some of these thought experiments, some of these experimental applications are going to go by the wayside. It's really going to come down to the brass tacks of what do we need in order to run this organization, in order to get the revenue in the door, take care of the customer, keep the operations going. If we have to start to shift our supply chains and create more diverse supply chains, how can we do that? All of these complexities and all of these factors are coming into a different decision-making capability within the organization. What I mean by that is, you might have said, okay, here's our plan to move to cloud with application A, B, and C. You might now be going, you know what? A is going to go, but B and C, we're going to sunset. We're just going to completely move that aside. Now, that would argue that both you and I are both wrong from our arguments that we're not necessarily staying in the data center, we're not necessarily going to cloud, the application or workload is just going away, or that function is moving somewhere else into maybe an existing application. The other piece that becomes really challenging in all of this is you can't shut down the data center until the last application moves out. And so this is another piece that people often get tripped up on, is they move a bunch of applications into cloud and they go, wait a second here, we're not seeing any cost savings in our corporate data center. What do we do? And the reality is it's not over till it's over, right?
Yeah.
You got to get it all out of there. So there are a lot of moving parts here. It's not as simple as just saying, hey, this one application moved to cloud, or we're moving everything to cloud. You and I both know, and we've had a lot of conversations over the years, this is not black and white, nor is it easy. IT is complicated, and it's important to respect and understand that.
Yeah, sorry about any background noise. We're all at home, right? So
yes, well, we are.
Well, in a small degree, I think you reinforced part of what I was saying. Not that I'm seeking that out in particular, but because it's not a binary thing. Application rationalization, where an application needs to reside and be managed and operated, is not a small decision, and it has long-lasting ramifications. Now, I will concede that I absolutely anticipate that software as a service companies who provide services that enable remote working, that help facilitate, like Zoom, Office 365 and Teams, Slack, we are going to see a huge increase in adoption after the end of this, particularly when you look at services that IT perhaps has delivered on premises in the data center and realized, wow, like we had never really sized for these many people, this number of people working from outside of the office. And like it's had a sizable impact. And we realized that this is not, core to our business for us to be making internal investments on. So I'll absolutely concede that one. Where do you see that?
Yeah, let me take that a step further. In some of the conversations I've been having with companies, and I'm a little surprised to hear some of these things come up, but there are companies that really had to rethink their strategies when people worked from home.
Mm-hmm.
So working from home at one level, when people decide, okay, I'm going to take the day and just work from home because I've got some other things going on, that's one thing. But when you're taking your entire base of employees and moving them home, it puts some strains on two things. One is your VPN.
Mm-hmm.
And there are still a lot of companies that leverage VPN for internal applications pretty heavily. The second, and so there's a licensing piece that comes out from that. If you were to move some of those productivity apps and some of those other functions outside of the enterprise, you might be able to limit the need for VPN in specific places. So that's one thing to consider. I'm not saying it completely goes away, but it definitely takes some pressure off. The second piece that I've seen a number of companies having to contend with is to set up split tunnel for their VPN.
Right.
So which is something that is kind of surprising that they were still running full tunnel. And for those of you that aren't familiar with this, what that essentially means is from that remote device, you're backhauling not just the traffic that is needed to go to those internal applications, but also all of the internet traffic has to go across this encrypted VPN, back into the enterprise, and then back out to the internet. Now, I can see how that might be something you might want to consider in certain cases for regulatory and compliance requirements where you need to monitor that traffic. But for a lot of folks, and in fact, a lot of companies that I've had conversations with, they aren't bound by those requirements, yet they were still running full tunnels. And so that puts a load not just on the VPN traffic, but then also your corporate traffic too. Mm-hmm. So these are aspects that have to change. And I think that will start to force, as you said, rethinking of maybe a move out of the corporate data center to 365 or Google Apps as a productivity suite, and looking at ways to kind of move some of this traffic around so you can be more flexible. The other piece that comes into play here is when you start to think about your business operations, and I fully expect we'll see people working from home on a more regular basis moving forward.
Absolutely.
There are already conversations about maybe remote offices. Do we still need these remote offices for people to go into and work? Maybe we have a corporate office, but maybe it's smaller. Maybe we get rid of the remote offices and people just work from home, because obviously this is the great experiment that we're doing right now, which is beneficial for IT. And that is, we're learning what it's like to basically send the world home to work from home.
Yeah, and I'm with you there. I think the remote offices are a lot of remote offices are going to become co-load field offices, right? Where they start renting a space. That's really unfortunate. WeWork went so poorly because this is, 6 months from now, they're that's the type of thing that I think is going to be, it's going to start being in higher demand as leases come up. I think there'll be a lot of interesting stuff around that. One other thing that, obviously being at Splunk, and, I'm little Splunk cat here, not a pitch, but because of my worldview, I see people who are monitoring and looking at data. And one thing I consistently have heard, particularly since all this happened, is that lack of visibility in what's happening in cloud services with some of the applications that they currently have had the promise of flexible scaling and having that agility, still lacking. A lot of organizations still lacking in maturity, again, companies like Splunk actively working to increase the type of things that you can can view and monitor. What about from your side? Are you seeing how are you seeing people handling this increase in utilization and import of these applications?
Well, I mean, in a lot of ways, it's just exacerbating what we already knew.
Yeah.
Right. Which is there was a limited amount of understanding, or that's not entirely fair. The degree of experience in working with cloud broadly across the enterprise was somewhat limited.
Mm-hmm.
And so this has also kind of forced us to rethink, how do we focus our teams into the right spaces? Now, the one thing I'll caution about here is that there's a lot of effort right now, kind of almost all hands on deck, just to keep people working and functioning remotely. This is, I mentioned that this is the great experiment. Well, it's a great experiment from another perspective too. How do you start to support these folks when you can't actually go and see them?
Right.
You can't touch their equipment. How do you handle things like patching remotely across someone's DSL or broadband line to their home? It's not as trivial as just simply give people equipment and send them home and everything else kind of follows the same. You've got support organizations that are doing support on home networks and
Right.
trying to help people get their home network up to snuff so that they can function. Because again, it's not just you or me going to work or working from home on one particular day and nobody else in the house. I mean, in my case, I've got two adults that are constantly on video conferencing, constantly on conference calls, and I've got two kids that are also on video conferencing
Right.
and taking structured classes throughout the day. So I've got 4 people now doing video conferencing all day,
Yep.
all at once on my home network. My network has never been taxed that much in the past.
Right.
And a lot of folks, it's the same situation. So there's a lot of the support, this new type of support that's coming about. And to make matters worse, you can't even go out and get a new cable modem or router or wireless device. It's really hard to find those. I mean, God forbid if you need to find a webcam or a keyboard or a monitor right now.
Yeah.
They're really, really hard to come by because everybody is having to contend with this. So right now, there's a lot of focus on work from home. I do think as that starts to stabilize, and I'm already seeing this in some organizations, there's the movement to look at business operations and how do we do things differently as we come out of this economic crisis, as we start to get into the next phase, if you will, of this social experiment. Because how we work going forward is going to be very different than how we worked 4 months ago. Yeah. Very different.
So you just gave me a thought to kind of potentially reinforce both of our perspectives on this. Once the dust settles, because I think it's reasonable to say that this is going to be a obviously fluid and fluctuating scenario where, we go out and we contract a little bit, just to maintain, distribution of the spread and how we respond to it. I think there is an opportunity here that because I know a lot of people are being able to tackle backlog that they weren't able to tackle before. And I appreciate that this may actually enable some applications who are next to get to the cloud a little bit faster. So let's assume that you're right and that the backlog is now getting tagged on. How do you think the cloud service providers are handling this thus far? And are they ready for the extra load?
So, I mean, to be fair, I think we're both right. Both of our perspectives are accurate. And the reason I say that is that every organization is different. Sure. But when you look at the cloud service providers, I don't think they're prepared for what's coming at them. I mean, we've seen that for the last several years where they've really, in mass, not trying to pick on any particular provider, but they've really struggled to understand how to engage with the enterprise and how to help them along this journey. And so then it's left up to the enterprise to kind of figure out, okay, so how do I get through this journey to cloud, and how do I do it in an appropriate way? And of course, some of these narratives, cloud is cheaper, cloud is easy, doesn't help. But the other thing is that's not a path that the enterprises necessarily had to take in the past, where they've had to figure out how to build the on-ramps to the freeway. You know, here's this beautiful freeway that the cloud providers have built. I'm not a road builder as an enterprise. I drive the car.
Yep.
But now the cloud provider is expecting me to build the on-ramp and off-ramp to the freeway. That's new ground for me. So I do think there's a bit of, they're not prepared. And I think once you start to see the momentum pick up on these cloud providers, I mean, we've seen it already. Those folks that were using enterprise applications in their data center absolutely struggled when people worked from home, because it's a totally different dynamic coming at them. Those folks that were leveraged in cloud-based services were able to scale appropriately. Now, I don't necessarily know what's going on in terms of the magic within the cloud service providers, but it seems like they've done fairly well, all things considered. Because remember, we've gone within a period of roughly 30 days around the world, 30 days to everybody working from a corporate environment to everybody working from home and changing the tools that they're using. Look at Zoom as an example. You know, just the number of multiples of people that are now using Zoom that weren't using it 4 months ago.
Yep.
I mean, it's incredible. So it depends on what class of provider you're talking about. If you're talking about a software as a service provider, if you're talking about an infrastructure as a service provider, but I think they are well positioned to be able to scale if they've architected their applications appropriately. Those that are new entrants, I think, are the ones that are probably struggling a little more because they had to make decisions because they're a startup. They're starting up something new, and they can't necessarily build for the big bang that we didn't realize was coming back in December. So it's a mixed bag. It's definitely a mixed bag.
Yeah, I mean, for me, we've talked about this internally with my team. It's good when we start going back to conferences again in 6 months. We'll just assume that, you know, we're going to assume that we flatten this out, but let's just say we flatten this out this fall. We're returning to conferences. The number of conference talks around how we survived or thrived during this scenario, I think is going to be telling, because I think it's going to be some of the same people, the people who talked over the last few years about their focus on increasing their agility and how they respond to changing market conditions or respond to customer demands. I think is going to be very telling. I mean, just as a great example, think about how many of the companies that we interact with when it comes to food and shipping and delivery, and how long it took many of them to get curbside or contactless or curbside as an option in their applications. Most of them have done it, and most of them it took within 2 weeks. A noticeable number had that as an option, but there's a lot of business processes and a lot of field processes that come along with those. And so that I think it's going to be very interesting once the conference talks really start picking up after the most of this has settled down. I think we're going to learn a lot about those who, whether they were on the cloud or on-prem, like had just set themselves up to be more agile.
Yeah, I think that, you know, there are a couple things to unpack there. And one is, I really wonder if conferences and the dynamic around conferences will change. I actually think they will pretty greatly, because people will still be concerned about being in close quarters with a lot of people.
Well, that's not even going to be the only thing. What I think is going to be, you know, being on the marketing side and on the back end, I think more organizations are going to realize, oh, we can get all of our target numbers without spending all that money on an on-person event.
Bingo.
And they're just going to be more discerning. And I'm not speaking to any background information on Splunk or like that. This is just me as a marketer and a constant conference goer.
No, but I mean, I'll make the point, and I'm not speaking specifically for Splunk. I have no inside information to Splunk, but I'll say that I think there are really creative and clever ways to be able to get the same information or more information targeted to the specific audience that you're hoping for. And so you don't have to necessarily put on this huge production and hopefully get what you're hoping for out of it. I think you can do that virtually. I mean, let's face it, Nobody makes a decision based on just going to one conference or having one tweet or one blog post that they read. It's a relationship over time. It's a particular problem they're trying to solve and trying to find a solution to that. And trying to time that with any given customer, I mean, it's kind of a fool's errand in a way. So I do think that you're right. There's going to be a changing of the dynamics around how we engage with customers and how we're more targeted in the information we get to the different personas. But I also think that it will change a lot of different dynamics. The physical in-conference experience, I think that will shift pretty considerably, at least for 6 months to probably a year or so, just until we have a better understanding of the dynamics around this particular virus. I mean, let's face it, I fully expect that there is another virus out there. There is another pandemic in our future. I mean, God forbid, does it have the same kind of hold as this one has had? And the downside of it, I mean, it's been terrible, both from a lives lost perspective, lives interrupted, all the way through to economic.
Right.
But I think we do need to think, we need to think more about what we're doing and what we're trying to do, and understand how we can do that in a maybe more clever way. And frankly, a lot of innovation comes out of crisis.
Yeah.
And so this is really an opportunity to drive us to get more creative, get more innovative, and figure out how can we do this. So you're at home, I'm at home. How can we still function? How can we still get our business to flourish in times like this? And so I think there are opportunities to do that, and we can continue to take those opportunities and carry them forward and build upon them as we go into the future. I don't necessarily think the in-person conference is necessarily going away, but I also don't think that it will be as prevalent as what we've seen in the past either.
Yeah, I agree 100%. One of the things that I've always found kind of ironic is that when you look at an in-person event, it's that serendipity of just like the hallway track, running into someone.
Yeah.
Like we're at an event, we run into each other. Oh, it's great to see. I mean, which is more often than not how we see each other, right?
That's right.
But the thing that's always been ironic to me is the fact that the internet's barrierless for all intents and purposes. Like, it was extremely complicated for us to get on this call to have this conversation, right? It's just a more purposeful act. And I think this is one of the areas where we're going to change. Like, I know the number of virtual happy hours I've attended in the last 3 weeks is 100 times more than what I did prior to those 3 weeks.
Yeah,
I just didn't
likewise.
do it very often. And so, yeah, no, I think I'm with you completely there. One last topic when it comes to cloud adoption after this. One of the barriers that I've always identified with when it comes to cloud adoption actually has nothing to do with whether or not an application can be there, but the data, getting the data there. A great example that we saw recently was with NASA. NASA was talking about putting 270 petabytes of data into the cloud. And then I think they got up to 1.2 petabytes, or maybe it was 12 petabytes. I can't remember where the decimal was. They didn't get very far, and they had already consumed most of the budget because of the data access, the egress, right? People were accessing the data and pulling, and they didn't fully factor that in. I know that data gravity, data locality, and of course, data transaction costs are very difficult to forecast. And sometimes time and physics just aren't on your side. Do you think that that model is going to change for people because of this as part of their adoption?
Well, I can't say that I officially have a crystal ball, but I do think that there will be a better understanding of how to manage data within cloud environments, both in and out of cloud environments. I mean, cloud data egress charges have always been kind of the bane of customers.
Egregious.
You've got to, I mean, when you are pulling that data out of cloud, right? That's, you know, that egress charge has been just, it's a killer. And so it's meant to create a sticky relationship with the cloud provider. I mean, call it what it is. But at the same time, I think there will be a better understanding of, you have to factor in not just your workload charges of, okay, I'm going to go to this reserved instance, I'm going to manage my costs this way, I'm going to, create this top end, refactor my application and re-architect it to be able to put some guardrails around it. That's one thing. But the reality is you also have to think about the data component too. And that network component, that data component can be really, really costly in such a way that you might say, maybe this isn't the right application to put in cloud, or maybe I need to refactor that application or re-architect it in such a way that the data is not leaving cloud as much, but rather it can stay within cloud. If you've got a large data set that you're dumping in cloud, I think of some of the research computing, which is, I don't know NASA's specific workload, but that you're talking about. But if you've got a large data set and you drop it into cloud, that's one thing. Do the analytics on it, do the work on it that you're trying to do, and then pull it back out. And now you're seeing this huge, huge cost.
Right.
Maybe the thing to do is there a way to move that secondary piece into cloud as well, such that you don't have to remove the data, or you can remove a piece of it? Those are always decisions and conversations that you have to look at as part of your cloud planning process.
Right.
But a lot of folks don't. They unfortunately don't realize it until they get the bill, and that's when they first realize it. And it goes back to what I was saying. You've got to think through these processes before you move to cloud.
Yeah, I know I've talked to a lot of people who, because of how they warehouse their data on-prem, like it's either cost prohibitive or time prohibitive. It's like getting terabytes of data into the cloud, while Snowball and Snowmobile and the other mechanisms that AWS has put up, it still takes a long time. I mean, physics is physics. And I think that's the one thing that, is a common thread through all of this, right? Bandwidth is limited because of physics. The ability for the cloud providers to deliver the amount of resources that projectedly could be required, physics. Like, you can only build servers so fast, you can only build hardware and get it implemented and getting it online so fast. Being able to move data across the wire, physics. It's all about, I mean, it always comes down to physics, all great intentions aside.
I mean, it's the speed of light, right? Until we fix the speed of light or change the dynamics on the speed of light, I mean, that's going to be our limiting factor for all of this. But this is where I think you have to step back and say, okay, I'm limited by physics. I'm limited by the speed of light. How can I get more clever in how I leverage these different solutions? So in some cases, I might say, this application is not a good application to move to cloud. Kind of to your point, maybe it makes sense to stay within the corporate data center, but maybe there's something else that does make more sense to move to cloud. Or in another situation, I might move that application to cloud, but there might be something else that I also want to move to cloud that I wasn't thinking about as a means to kind of deal with some of those costs.
Right.
Again, IT is complicated, and you can't look at each of these factors in a silo. You have to look at how they all come together and how they stitch together.
Right.
It's kind of like the background in your video, right? It's this lacing of different connections. And when we're in a corporate data center, we can make all of these assumptions that, oh, the application's just over there, I'm just gonna make that connection, I'm good to go. No harm, no foul, no cost. Cloud, that's not necessarily the case. I don't have a 10 gigabit connection that is just a cross connect from one system to another. It's a little more complicated and a lot more costly.
Yeah, and it's interesting because from an architect's perspective, like longtime data center architect, had only begun scratching the surface of being a cloud architect and a cloud consumer. But that was a big thing, right? Aside from not always knowing if you're getting a guarantee of what you were buying, it was one of those like, well, cost and the appropriate use of each feature was a big component. So, well, with that, I've developed some background noise, so I apologize to anyone
No
listening or
worries.
watching who picked that up. Again, we're all at home, and it's stressful for us all. So, Tim, this has been great. It's been great talking with you. I think you stated it earlier. We both have a strong arm in the truth with what we expect enterprises to deal with, and I think we ought to probably sync up again here in about 6 months, revisit this, and see if we're seeing a big uptick and where and how. I think that would be fun.
That'd be great. It's always great to chat with you, Josh.
All right, Tim, let's do it again sometime soon. All right, with that, signing out. I'm Josh Atwell.
Tim Crawford.
All right, take care.
Thanks.
All right.